Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for May 30th, 2022, around 3:40 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the potential for a new tropical system to be forming in the Gulf of Mexico over the next several days and what impacts it could be bringing to portions of Cuba, the Yucatan Peninsula, and Florida over the next several days. Jumping straight into everything, taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we notice that things are on the uptick across the area. We do have a large area of showers and thunderstorm activity across portions of the Caribbean right now in extreme southern Gulf of Mexico. And then we have Hurricane Agatha over here now approaching Mexico. This is rapidly approaching the Mexican coastline, expected to make landfall within the next several hours. And this will be a contributor to what might be forming out in this region over the next several days. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. Taking a real quick look here at Hurricane Agatha, you can see maximum sustained winds are roughly around 105 to 110 miles per hour based on the latest recon plane that was in there from earlier this afternoon sampling. We notice that there is kind of this little eye depression here that is now starting to show up, and that's the best attempt that we've seen at an eye over the last several days. This was expected yesterday to become a powerful major hurricane, and it is on the cusp of doing so and could be strengthening right up until landfall, so it is still possible that this officially gets a designation, but either way, a difference between, 5 and 10 miles per hour is not really going to make much of a difference really for portions of Mexico. And if we take a wider look at this, we can see that this is still a pretty large system. Again, this really has increased in size since yesterday. And because of that, there's a wider area that is going to be expecting and experiencing tropical storm and hurricane conditions. Again, this is now rapidly approaching landfall within the next couple of hours and will be moving through very mountainous terrain over the next several days. So this is expected to rapidly weaken. But we notice that we have a pretty good fetch of onshore flow at the moment. This is kind of moving due northeast. And again, we have a pretty good fetch of onshore flow, even well away from this storm. So coastal areas well away from here could experience some pretty dangerous and disastrous storm surge impacts, and also again a lot of heavy rainfall. And because this area, especially north of here, is very mountainous, we could be dealing with extreme flash flooding conditions, mudslides, tornadoes. And unfortunately, because this area of Mexico, especially the further north you get, isn't really well built and it's much more of a poorer area, the loss of life potential is certainly higher. And that's one of my grave concerns, that even though this isn't really, high up there on the wind scale, tremendous rainfall, storm surge, in just the impacts you would expect, could be amplified, especially going over higher terrain, squeezing out all that moisture, and unfortunately creating a bit of a flash flooding and mudslide problem over the next several days. So if we go back here and look in time, this is looking at the HWARF forecast, or this is basically the analysis over the last several days. What really allowed Agatha to develop was this very well developed anticyclonic flow around the storm environment during the last several days. Basically, air in the upper part of the atmosphere diverging and allowing convergence at the surface, diverging air aloft, and it creates kind of a vacuum. And that was allowing the storm to continuously intensify. But as we progressed throughout the last several hours, and really from yesterday, there was still a little bit of shear, because we can tell that there's kind of an anticyclonic flow over here near the equatorial Pacific here. And this has actually been creating a little bit of westerly shear that has been impinging on Agatha during the last several days. And that has not allowed the storm to intensify as greatly as we first thought. Yesterday it was kind of defying the odds, but last night some of the dry air from the Mexican plateau and the higher terrain was kind of sucked in here. That shear forced this dry air in, and it kind of disrupted the overall process of generating new convection and allowing the vortex from the low and mid-level centers to be aligned. When you have a misalignment like you had with Agatha, it doesn't really allow the storm to intensify much. It can actually cause a great deal of weakening. That didn't really happen here, unfortunately. However, we can see at the current time, this was 8 a.m. this morning, there was still a little bit of westerly shear. That's honestly going to continue up until landfall. And even after landfall, that shear is expected to continue. This goes through the next 24 hours. And we can see that there's going to be an increased amount of shear over the next several days. So once this moves inland, it is rapidly expected to weaken here, especially once crossing the higher train in that region, and that should considerably weaken it, but it will still be a rainmaker over the next several days. Now, the remnants of this may eventually reemerge with a much broader area of low pressure in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean over the next several days. A very complex area of low pressure is expected to develop, and the National Hurricane Center is giving this area a 40% chance of development over the next 5 days, as this is expected to generally move eastward or northeastward over the next several days. And this could create a bit of a problem, especially for the Yucatan Peninsula and portions of Cuba, for the potential of significant flooding over the next several days. And then eventually this could creep towards Florida or portions of the Bahamas as we progress with time. So we'll go ahead and look at those possibilities now. This is the 12Z GFS, the forecast valid for 2 p.m. this afternoon. Again, this is the 850 millibar vorticity. So all this is spin in the atmosphere at 5,000 feet above the ground level. This is cyclonic vorticity, so anything that is shaded here is representing a cyclonic flow. In the northern hemisphere, we would associate cyclonic flow with, well, an area of low pressure. And these higher contours in here, these 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., this indicates that there's higher spin at 5,000 feet. So you can see a very well distinct shape here of Hurricane Agatha. This is what we would look for in a tropical system, a tropical storm or hurricane. We would look for this little ball right here of consolidated vorticity. So this shows a very well developed area of low pressure. Again, it's a category 2 hurricane moving inland over the next few days here. Now, we're going to be really turning our attention out to this area because we can see as we move forward in time, we get kind of this broad area of low pressure, this big, broad low. And this seems to be coherent with a Central American gyre. We were talking about this over the last several days. We've been talking about this even the last several weeks, that we had one earlier this month, and that could have sparked development, and it didn't. But we had the Central American gyre down here, and a new one is beginning to kind of take shape here. And this might allow for something to kind of spurt out of this complex area of low pressure and move somewhere. Now, on the GFS forecast, we get this area of vorticity that begins to kind of emerge over portions of Cuba, and that eventually crosses into the Bahamas Straits here, or through the Florida Straits into the Bahamas, and moves on out to sea, where it finally generates a storm here. But this is looking at June 8th, but even before that, some areas of vorticity that tries to close off here into what's presumably a tropical cyclone. Now, this is on the GFS forecast. One of the problems, which we'll talk about in a minute, is shear. Now, if we look here at the European forecast, this is a 12Z Euro forecast. The European has a little bit of a different solution. It kind of maintains a much broader area of low pressure with two kind of competing lobes. This is the remnants of Agatha, and this is kind of a new area of low pressure. And these kind of dance around each other for the next several days before lifting northward. And eventually, by day 5, you get what seems to be a disorganized but compact area of low pressure moving northeastward towards the Florida Peninsula, and then crossing the Florida Peninsula after that and strengthening. Now, is this a possible solution? Yes, this is. We'll look at the European ensembles for this time, and we'll look here at the 200 millibar wind. Now, what this is showing is we're looking at wind shear in the upper part of the atmosphere at 200 millibars. So 200 millibars is roughly about 30 to 39,000 feet. So just think of it as it's the wind patterns at the cruising altitude of airliners. Okay, just kind of take that into perspective. And we notice that again, here's what you would like in a storm: anticyclonic flow aloft, diverging air aloft, converging air at the surface creates a vacuum. But we notice that in the forecast from the European, where is that? Well, that's in the Caribbean, closer to Central America than anything. And in fact, that is a boatload of shear that is approaching Florida with this system, that it would be approaching Florida. And that's why I'm saying that this is not necessarily a guarantee. If you look at the European ensemble forecast here, this is the 6Z run of that. But we notice that the European ensembles have quite a range of different areas of low pressure, basically a big envelope, anywhere from still over the Yucatan Peninsula to now emerging closer to Florida. And if we look at the GFS ensembles, there's a clustering from, again, still over the Yucatan to over portions of Cuba and the Florida Straits. So there's a big difference here because the European goes for a more northerly solution, the GFS is more southerly, and this is by a couple hundred miles. So there's a pretty big disconnect between what the GFS and Euro still think. And of course, the Euro is a bit more aggressive with development chances. If we look at the GFS ensembles, you can see why nothing develops here, because by hour 120, there's just too much shear on the order of about 40 to 50 knots. This would be creating pretty high shear in the upper part of the atmosphere, not really allowing for anything to develop with an anticyclone really over Jamaica and the Caribbean. So not really seeing the odds for significant development at this time. However, I do think that there could still be something. At the end of the day, we could still see a hybrid system approaching Florida within the next 5 or to 6 days. So for folks there in Central Florida, the Florida Keys, Bahamas, Cuba, yes, you need to be paying attention to what could be occurring over the next 5 days, because you could have a tropical system approaching, but it is uncertain at this time. All right. With that being said, there is also a moderate risk for severe weather today across portions of the high plains into portions of Minnesota. 15% tornado risk with a PDS tornado watch out already, and the potential for some significant wind and hail impacts as well. All right, so be safe if you're up there. And for the day 2 outlook, we have an enhanced risk across portions of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, with a surrounding marginal and slight risk, and a marginal risk for most of the entire Florida peninsula. All right, with that being said, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Mike O'Malley. I'll talk to you guys again some more in the few days.